I want to talk this morning about the city of Detroit's grand adventure in creating a light rail system. I propose not only to celebrate Detroit's wisdom in joining the parade of transit-embracing cities, but also to explore issues that may provide a glimpse into some of the challenges and opportunities facing municipal transit. I'll describe why light rail was important to the city, how we got started, what obstacles we encountered, and where we find ourselves now. I'll then extract a set of principles I hope will have broader implications across America. And you'll have to forgive me if some of those are repetitive of what you've been hearing for the last couple of days. It's been an extraordinary agenda from what I can tell talking to many of you in the audience, but treat it as summative. If there were ever an environment resistant to mass transit, it's been the birthplace of the automobile, Detroit and its surrounding counties. The region is inadequately covered by two separate bus systems, one city, one suburban, and has failed countless times to establish a regional transit authority to build out a unified system. But over the last 6 or 7 years, the unimaginable happened. Philanthropy and the private sector put stakes in the ground to change all of that. Now, shortly after I arrived at Kresge 7 years ago, I had lunch with Roger Penske, who's a legendary figure in car racing, the owner of the Penske automotive empire, and without question, Michigan's most respected civic leader. Having just overseen Detroit's successful hosting of the Super Bowl, Roger was thinking about what his next civic project might be. I suggested that the city desperately needed light rail along Woodward Avenue, an imposing state-controlled road running from the central business district to the outer suburbs. It's the region's spinal cord. Roger and I discussed 3 major benefits of creating a light rail line that would run from the Detroit River on the south terminus 3.5 miles through Midtown and on to Detroit's North End neighborhood. First, it would create new connections among the scores of commercial, cultural, medical, and educational institutions dispersed along the avenue. Second, it would revitalize the local economy and resuscitate the tax base by encouraging dense patterns of land use as housing, retail, and other amenities began to populate the areas within walking distance of the stops. And third, it would create the first leg of a regional transportation system. It would connect to an Amtrak line running west to Ann Arbor and Chicago and to a fixed rail line to the northern job centers of Oakland County. And a mass transit project in the ground in southeast Michigan would satisfy essential preconditions for the region to compete for the New Start's dollars necessary for the build-out of a truly regional transit system. Now, Roger took our conversation seriously. He convened a couple dozen civic leaders to discuss the feasibility of a privately financed line that would be turned over in due course to a public operating authority. It could be done, but the price tag would be about $100 million. And I'll never forget it. Roger looked at me in a meeting and said that if Kresge would be willing to invest the first $35 million, he would enlist others to secure the rest. You know, at one level, it was really a crazy idea. Municipal governments, not foundations, build streetcars. But the audacity of the aspiration justified the risk, or so it seemed to me. So I agreed, and we moved forward. We quickly formed a philanthropic private sector consortium named M1 Rail after Woodward's designation as Michigan's first paved road. Roger, indeed, raised $39 million by convincing hospitals, businesses, universities, and others to commit $3 million to the naming rights for stops. We secured a $25 million Tiger One grant and locked in millions in New Markets tax credit commitments. We put together a team with the requisite financial, engineering, and project management sophistication. Over the next 6 years, we navigated a seemingly endless cascade of obstacles. You know, we expected engineering complexity and cost increases, but we were taken aback by the fierceness of local and bureaucratic resistance. It took 3 forms. Let me say a word just about each. First was the city of Detroit itself. When we began, Detroit Mayor Kilpatrick's administration had a very different view of what should be done. They had secured a planning grant for a commuter rail line running 8 miles from the river to the city limits. It would have eased the commute for suburbanites, but would not have connected Detroit residents to jobs, nor stimulated transit-oriented development at the scale we needed. For the better part of 2 years, M1 and the city mud-wrestled to clarify which of the 2 visions would be pursued. We finally forged a compromise. The portion from the river to Midtown would be designed according to the M1 objectives of maximizing land use along 12 stops. The portion from Midtown to the city limits would be shaped by the city to maximize the number of commuters. It looked as if we had steered around the potentially fatal political and engineering shoals. We had little idea that we would almost run to ground because of obstacle number 2, the Federal Department of Transportation. Ray LaHood, then Secretary of Transportation, was deeply supportive at a meta level of the path-breaking private philanthropic partnership at the heart of M1 and its importance to the city's revitalization. But the frontline decision maker was the Federal Transit Administration, and there things become a little bit more complicated. The administrator, Peter Rogoff, was a no-nonsense guy who brought a healthy and understandable dose of skepticism. Where would accountability lie if this philanthropic private sector coalition stepped into the shoes of a municipality? Who would ultimately run the railroad? Who would be responsible for revenue shortfalls? These were legitimate questions, and we were confident that we could answer them. But as the stakes grew higher, it became painfully clear that the city simply could not make available the capital necessary to execute the commuter rail portion of the plan. They were unable to deliver their promised bonds. That completely upset the apple cart. And the feds were caught in an impossible position. They simply couldn't move forward with the plan as it stood. Together with the governor and mayor, they accordingly announced publicly a fallback plan to scuttle the M1 project, as well as the longer line in favor of a regional bus rapid transit system. They also announced their decision to repurpose the Tiger grant we had secured to the BRT. Our initial reaction was that after 5 years of work, we probably needed to throw in the towel. The federal secretary, the governor, and the mayor were all moving in another direction. But we threw up a Hail Mary, one final mega meeting between the M1 leadership and Secretary LaHood, Administrator Rogoff, Governor Snyder, now Mayor Bing, as well as Senators Levin and Stabenow, the House delegation, the Wayne County executive, you name it, and more staff members than you can count. The M1 team made the case that before we left more than $100 million of private capital on the table, capital that would not be available for BRT, the consortium should be given 90 days to demonstrate the feasibility of the original plan, a streetcar project funded outside of the city's bonding capacity. Secretary LaHood listened very carefully, made sure the governor was on board, and then committed that if M1 could meet every engineering, financial, environmental, and political requirement that the FTA could identify, he would give us a chance. In fact, he went a step further. He said that he would permit the state to retain the $25 million Tiger grant to start implementation of a regional BRT system, but would, if in fact M1 could satisfy the FTA's conditions, find another $25 million for M1 from somewhere in the department's budget. His top advisor just about had a heart attack. She jumped out of her chair and she said, Mr. Secretary, you aren't able to make that commitment. It was really hysterical. You could have heard a pin drop. LaHood just sort of turned to her, looked at her for a couple of seconds, and then turned back to me and said, I commit to you that if you're successful, I will find you the $25 million you need. You have 90 days. If you ever wondered what leadership looked like, wonder no longer. Although those 90 days eventually became more like 120, the effort was successful. We checked off each of the 90 issues the federal government certified. It became clear that the secretary and administrator deeply wanted the effort to succeed. They clarified regulatory requirements, worked with the governor to identify what state-level safeguards the feds would insist on, and traveled to Michigan several times to advocate publicly for the creation of a regional transit governance authority. They even extended our time to get even more questions answered. Secretary LaHood returned to Detroit at the end of the period to announce the federal government's complete support for the project, including making good on his commitment to free up $25 million from the other sources within his department. I have no idea where his aide is now. Yeah. So, having surmounted the city and federal obstacles, we had one more, with the state of Michigan. The Michigan Department of Transportation had been among our staunchest allies. They agreed to bear the cost and the potential risks of repaving the length of Woodward as part of the project. They assigned some of the department's most talented personnel to provide technical assistance. But all of this might have come to naught if we couldn't secure a regional transit authority. One of the FTA's conditions was that the passage of legislation authorizing an RTA with the power to pursue county referenda approving expenditures for the regional system. Very reasonable. The problem was that the Michigan legislature had tried and failed 24 times in the last 45 years to pass legislation like this. Not 4 times, not 14 times, 24 times. Although we were able to get the legislation drafted and introduced, it had stalled. And this is where our private sector partners were beyond spectacular. Kresge couldn't lobby, but they could. They joined with Governor Snyder to create the kind of legislative strategy that could convince the Republican-controlled House and Senate to pass 8 separate pieces of necessary legislation. And indeed, the legislators stepped up and passed them. There have been and will continue to be other obstacles. Perhaps most vexingly, the political detours caused delays, which in turn raised the project cost to $175 million, required us to renegotiate the new market's tax credits, and generated widespread public skepticism that we would ever break ground. But we raised another $75 million, resecured the credits, and broke through the political underbrush. M1 broke ground last month and will welcome its first passenger in 2016. Thank you. You know, it's tempting to write off the Detroit experience as idiosyncratic, one city in particular duress struggling through unique challenges. But I'd like to suggest a handful of principles that strike me as logical extensions of the Detroit and related experiences. Principles that speak to the kind of transit our country will need in order to accommodating our changing demographics, growing economic uncertainties, and shifting forms of urbanization. So, principle number 1. Transit should be as much about experiencing place as it is about efficiency and movement. One of the biggest shifts in transportation policy and practice over the last decade has been balancing efficiency and mobility with an attention to how transit can enhance identity and a quality of place. Community development has always sought to improve the quality of life in distressed places. We attach to a place with an emotional energy and a sense of long-term commitment that is often definitional to how a community works and to how group identity is forged. We're witnessing countless examples across the country of how transit can contribute to that sense of place. From streets becoming destinations in and of themselves, think 16th Street in Denver, to pedestrian corridors that redefine the public realm, like the Nicollet Mall right outside our door, to rail-to-trail reclamations in places like Atlanta and Detroit. Lest we take this for granted, let me offer an example from my time heading the Kresge Foundation here in Minneapolis of just how difficult this integration of transit and community development can be. Peter McLaughlin, are you still here? Uh-oh. Yeah, he does know this story. I always bring a truth squad with me just in case. About a decade ago, Hennepin County announced plans to repave a 2-mile stretch of Lake Street, the city's main artery running through some of its poorest neighborhoods. The proposed redesign had long been contemplated by the county as an upgrade that could help revitalize the neighborhood. But that stretch had become the hub of Somali, Ethiopian, and Hispanic entrepreneurship, brimming with markets, restaurants, small businesses, and community gathering spaces, virtually all on the razor's edge of viability. The collision of these two worlds was, in retrospect, inevitable. The engineer's vision of improvement was to widen the street, carve out more turn lanes, eliminate street parking, narrow the sidewalks, and otherwise facilitate moving more traffic faster. And that was all by the book, but it was potentially ruinous to the character of the place. I got a call at the 11th hour from a group of residents to ask if McKnight would help develop alternatives, to narrow and reconfigure the lanes for buses and bicycles, widen the sidewalks to promote street life, preserve on-street parking to encourage people to visit the adjacent businesses, and redesign the road architecture to create community focal points. In a word, to reallocate the space with a bias toward community livability. The discussions we entered were quite difficult. County engineers brought out mind-numbingly complex, self-fulfilling computer traffic flow models that posited faster car trips as an inviolable first principle. That sound familiar? In response, our engineers, which we drew from Project for Public Spaces, constructed very different parking, transit, pedestrian, and land use models, all based on the first principle of elevating the identity, function, and integrity of the place. We eventually found a middle ground that yielded a variety of benefits for the community. And I must say it was in large part because of Peter stepping in and really helping the county sort of weigh in on what ended up being, I think, a very beneficial compromise. But it was nevertheless a vivid illustration that conventional transportation planning and contemporary community development imperatives are, or at least were at that time, alien cultures lacking a common vocabulary and ready mechanisms for cross-fertilization. Peter and I were talking just a moment ago and agree that we've moved light years from the Lake Street circumstance. The public, private, and philanthropic sectors now view transit planning, whether for road reconstruction, light rail, bikeways, or rapid transit, as an exercise in community development and placemaking, an opportunity to stack and align those elements of community that shape healthy, vital places. And that leads me to principle number 2. Because it has to recognize the primacy of place, transit can no longer be a self-contained exercise in mobility planning and engineering optimization, but must instead interweave with the multiple mutually interdependent public systems that define a place. Public agencies may organize vertically into silos of matter expertise, housing, economic development, health, transportation, but people live horizontally. A community member's livelihood may depend on the convenience of travel between her home and her workplace. Her health may be compromised by the proximity of truck traffic routes servicing a rail yard, or may be improved by her access to affordable, high-quality community health care. Transit is embedded in each of these systems. Expanded mobility connects individuals to opportunities, whether employment, commercial, recreational, or cultural. But it also determines the arc of neighborhoods, of cities, and of regions as a whole, as a catalyst for economic development, as a magnet for the attraction and retention of talent, by stemming the trend toward job sprawl and the resulting housing employment mismatches. Transit can, in a word, be the foundation for cities that are competitive in a 21st century world. To do that, transit is increasingly being asked to help create and enhance the kind of communities that people want to live in and that you've been talking about for the last number of days. And it can do that only by connecting a multiplicity of systems. These connections have begun to erode the walls separating transportation professionals from community development professionals. That trend has been accentuated by many of the national trade and advocacy groups in the room today: Smart Growth America, PolicyLink, the Urban Land Institute, and many others, and enlightened policies such as HUD's Sustainable Community Programs, whose goddess, Shelley Peticha, is with us this morning. You really are my goddess, Shelley. It's terrific. What she did at HUD was just spectacular. The Detroit example exemplifies what this can look like. The M1 systems planning was nestled within a 4-year community-based visioning effort called the Detroit Future City Plan, a decision-making framework to bolster the city's nodes of strength and to convert underutilized land to more productive uses. The plan recognized the multidimensional impact transit would play in the city's future development. It would concentrate small businesses at key nodes along the city's corridors. It would combine with large-scale development, such as a new hockey arena just announced a couple of weeks ago, to create walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods. It would dramatically improve access to health centers, schools, and other institutions, and it would create unprecedented connections between urban core residents and the region's job centers. So substitute Los Angeles or Salt Lake City or the Twin Cities or Baltimore, and you'll get the same convergence. So principle number 3, transit decision-making should increasingly be shaped by engaging low-income communities. You know, if one's frame of reference is regional competitiveness, it's easy to conceive of the primary transit constituency as the business community. If that frame is urban vitality, it's equally easy to focus on the hipster, millennial cohort. And if the frame is relieving congestion, it's natural to zero in on suburbanites who make most of the cross-regional trips. These frames aren't mutually exclusive, of course, but the frame has to be broader still, to incorporate the centrality of transit in shaping opportunity for low-income people, a population disproportionately dependent on transit and for whom transit projects can have both salutary and deleterious impacts. Let's start with the negative side of the equation. Transit has had a checkered history of too frequently marginalizing or outright harming low-income communities. The examples are legion and painful, from freeways that sundered African American communities to Robert Moses's notorious construction of Long Island Expressway bridges so low that buses couldn't get to amenities like Jones Beach outside the city. You know, it's a depressing litany, and nor is it limited to the last century. In the here and now, the same trends that make transit such a magnet can also push away low-income residents as housing and commercial costs increase. There's been so much discussion about intended and unintended consequences of gentrification and displacement that I can't pretend to add anything you haven't already thought about. So let's instead consider the mirror image, how future transit planning can benefit from the full inclusion of low-income communities' wisdom and perspective. Now, community engagement is mandated by all manner of federal, state, and local regulations, but these processes too often skim across the surface of the minimally required and unyieldingly formulaic. The Lake Street reconstruction example demonstrates the value of equipping the community with tools to engage seriously with decision makers on issues that are often viewed as the exclusive province of the technically trained and bureaucratically invested. Let me suggest two other considerations that can help community engagement take on an even more layered, consequential role. First, animating projects with a sensitivity to the need and aspirations of low-income people can ensure that transit is a bridging tool, not a wedging tool. Transit, at the end of the day, is a powerful form of social connective tissue. It can draw a thread through distinct places, diverse communities of people, different economic, cultural, social, and historical patrimonies. It can help diffuse urban-suburban polarities, and it invites us all to a fuller understanding of the other. I love the example of Bolivia's Teleferico, an aerial tramway that connects La Paz, which is located in a valley and the seat of government and old colonial money, and El Alto, sitting on the high plateau above and home to a poorer, younger, and more ethnically indigenous population. This wondrous new aerial cable car system has been described as a cross between a ski gondola and an elevated train. In its first 2 months of operations, it carried some 40,000 people per day. It aims to erode the physical and psychological barriers between the two places, enabling, in one local expert's view, a dialogue between the two cultures, a connection that is going to break down borders. A second device for calling on community voice is the arts. Community engagement matters, not only because it ensures a voice for residents in shaping their future, but also because it can generate enduring, informal networks of support that bond people one to another and that bridge across difference. The centrality of arts and culture to social cohesion is insufficiently understood. One leading study found that the social and civic engagement associated with the arts in urban neighborhoods was positively correlated with lower rates of social distress, improvements in the local economy, and declines in poverty. Incorporating community-driven creative placemaking into transit projects accordingly has the potential to be more than embellishment. It promises to strengthen social cohesion and imbue a location with meaning and significance. I don't think there's any better example of that what Springboard for the Arts has accomplished on the Green Line here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. As you all probably know by now, it's trained some 600 artists to undertake 150 projects to drive traffic to the scores of small, largely immigrant and minority-owned businesses during construction, hoping to build a loyalty that would permit the shops to thrive after the line opened. It's happened. And beyond the business benefits, the effort promises an enduring sense of cultural identity. So principle number 4, transit infrastructure has to increasingly serve on the front lines of the battle to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Climate change has set in motion forces that will forever change the nature of life in America's cities. Although it poses threats to us all, in almost every case, those threats are borne disproportionately by those who are already most disadvantaged, low-income people, the elderly, and the housebound. We can enlist transit in facing down this threat, but it will have to do double duty. Transit will have to contribute to society's attempts, first, to avoid the unmanageable, and second, to manage the unavoidable. Avoiding the unmanageable through approaches that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Managing the unavoidable by anticipating and adapting to now inevitable changes. Much of transit policy and practice represents a powerful response to the first part of the question. Transit lines minimize society's carbon footprint by getting people into vehicles of mass mobility and by encouraging denser, more energy-efficient development. But the second part of the question is trickier. As Wayne Gretzky famously advised, you have to skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is. How will transit design and operation anticipate and protect against the consequences of rises in sea level, the spike in heat islands, and the ever-increasing frequency and severity of storms, to name just a few? We need to start considering some really tough choices. For example, our responses to Katrina and Sandy have afforded a glimpse into how difficult it is to entertain whether to rebuild in harm's way, whether housing, roads, hospitals, or educational institutions. I would argue that we have little choice but to invent mechanisms, including transit, that make it possible for individuals and communities to reimagine things that they have come to take for granted. So principle number 5, there is a need for next frontier innovation in the financing of transit infrastructure and the development of transit corridors. As federal sources of transit funding become more difficult to come by, and as we continue to defer expenditures, capital innovation becomes essential. The first dimension of this innovation is expanding the range of who pays. Detroit's mobilization of private finance for the M1 project is certainly an example. It was the first time, to my knowledge, that a private foundation had invested directly in the hard infrastructure of a transit project. But we're seeing other examples as well, such as the recently opened New York Avenue Metro station in Washington, D.C., where private developers contributed to the financing of a station that will raise the value of nearby real estate. A second dimension is more creatively and cost-effectively connecting direct transit costs to expenditures for associated infrastructure. Infrastructure bundling has been critical to Detroit's M1 project. As I mentioned, as M1 tears up the road, the Michigan Department of Transportation is bearing the cost of repaving it, repairing overpasses, and replacing other key infrastructure. And a third dimension is extending financial innovation beyond the transit itself to the complexities of financing transit corridor development. We've seen a variety of innovation move in this direction. One is for the public sector to leverage the value of land owned by transit agencies or municipalities around transit stations and along transit lines. Using or disposing of that land strategically to incorporate affordable housing, job centers that include low and mid-skilled jobs, and community facilities like libraries or healthcare clinics can yield more ridership and more long-term benefit to the community than simply selling land to the highest bidder. A second strategy for financing transit corridors is for government and philanthropy to use their resources wisely to attract and leverage private investment. Capturing a portion of the increased value that results from publicly funded infrastructure, whether through tax increment financing, business improvement districts, or other devices, can help finance non-revenue generating amenities that contribute to a quality of place, whether it's green space, bike lanes, public art, or others. Similarly, by skillfully crafting the rules that govern the use of its funding, government can multiply the dollars available for healthy, equitable, and sustainable transit-oriented development, including subsidizing affordability to ensure that lower-income residents have the option to live in neighborhoods closest to transit. For example, the Bay Area's Regional Planning Organization, the MTC, has invested $10 million to create a $50 million transit-oriented affordable housing fund that provides flexible financing to developers for the acquisition and development of affordable housing near transit stops across the region. So let me turn then to the final principle, principle number 6. Transit decisions at all points of the life cycle will be driven by a broader spectrum of civic actors playing different roles than in the past. You know, Detroit is a remarkable example of how the philanthropic, private, and nonprofit sectors can supplement the public sector in shaping a region's transit trajectory. It looks like we actually may be onto something. The U.S. Bank Foundation is providing capital and operating support for the Cincinnati line, as is Amazon in Seattle. But let me offer another example of how this more distributive leadership model can take shape. In 2003, the president of the University of Minnesota, a guy named Mark Yudof, issued a challenge to the Twin Cities region. The region was becoming increasingly complacent, he argued, with no strategy for how it would keep the edge needed to compete in the 21st century. The challenge provoked Larry Perlman, who was then the head of the region's leading technology company, Control Data, to ask me, as I was the head of the McKnight Foundation, to co-convene the business leadership of the region to see what might be done. I in turn formed a small work group to choreograph a process that could produce tangible, actionable strategies. We planned for nearly a year, using McKinsey to interview more than 100 corporate CEOs, reviewing municipal planning documents, and testing the interests of key participants. Larry and I then wrote a letter inviting 50 civic leaders to a meeting at the McKnight offices to review what, in effect, was a regional business plan. It was an ambitious invite list. The CEOs of companies like 3M, Best Buy, Medtronic, and Northwest Airlines, as well as the governor, the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the head of the Metropolitan Council, the president of the university, and many others. Every single one of them showed up at that first meeting of what came to be called the Itasca Project, which was named for the Mississippi Headwaters Park, where almost 50 years earlier, Minneapolis's corporate leaders had begun holding annual planning retreats. And our updated version kept coming, not their vice presidents of community affairs, but the principals, quarter after quarter. The Itasca Project is still meeting more than a decade later. And the first couple of meetings were memorable for a number of reasons. First, the group endorsed 4 main priorities and committed its energies to attacking them. McKinsey's CEO survey had identified 4 main priorities: the creation of a regional transit system, the improvement of early childhood, augmented patent transfer, and reductions in health disparities. This list surprised and absolutely infuriated the state's most powerful business organizations, for whom the beginning and the end of a business agenda was reducing taxes and easing regulatory burdens. But Itasca, which consisted, after all, of the members of the business organizations, forged ahead nevertheless, setting up working groups for each of the 4 areas. Each would be co-chaired by 2 CEOs and staffed by a combination of McKinsey, McKnight, and topical experts from the nonprofit and academic communities. This last piece was a pivotal decision because it inserted the nonprofit sector's expertise and perspectives directly into the decision-making process. The second memorable aspect of the early meetings was that Itasca chose to meet without an executive director, budget, or formal governance structure. And to bring this back to into the realm of relevance to all of you, Itasca's third key move was to elevate transit as its first all-in effort. That decision changed the arc of Minnesota transit history. One of the co-chairs of the transit work group was the brilliant and elegant Charlie Zelli, the head of Jefferson Bus Lines. If that name sounds familiar to those of you in the audience, it's because 2 years ago, Charlie would be named by Governor Dayton as the head of the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Charlie's work group's first step was to commission a former head of the Metropolitan Council, Kurt Johnson, to distill from the wisdom of countless transit plans that had been floated over the last 20 years a comprehensive, up-to-the-moment plan susceptible of adoption by the legislature and the governor. The work group then launched one of the most sophisticated advocacy campaigns the state had seen, arranging visits of public officials to Denver and Seattle to see how transit could be launched, developing a far-reaching public relations campaign, hosting every single key legislator from both parties at a dinner with one of Itasca's CEOs, creating unassailable case statements for each and every piece of the plan, and on and on. The Itasca Project engineered the passage of a legislative package that essentially enshrined Kurt Johnson's blueprint and called for the set-aside of billions of dollars for its implementation. Governor Valenti vetoed the package. But in a testimonial to the Itasca members' work, the Republican-controlled legislature overrode the veto of their party's leader, and the legislation became law. And you've all heard about the fruits of that work: the North Star commuter rail line from the north, the Green Line between the 2 downtowns, the planned extension of the Green Line to the southwest suburbs, and many others, all birthed from a unique private, public, philanthropic, nonprofit partnership. The billions of dollars being invested across the country as we speak in new and expanded transit systems represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reshape the built environments of our metropolitan areas in ways that can make communities more distinctive, more economically competitive, healthier, more equitable, and more sustainable. Realizing that potential will require new ways of thinking and new forms of practice, rooted in integrating transit planning with other disciplines and forming partnerships across sectors. Very difficult stuff. But it's from the cauldron of that kind of complexity that innovation is catalyzed. A new chemistry that contrives toward ingenuity and reconceived standards of excellence. That's why I'm so glad you've gathered over these last number of days. It's an opportunity to reflect on what our larger social, economic, and political systems need as we recalibrate our approach to transit. So keep pushing, keep taking risks, and very best of luck. Thank you very much.